Good to go.
Hello.
Okay, I'll get us started. Hey everyone, welcome to another webinar with the SustainUS Creative Challenge. Our focus today is on displacement, and leading the webinar will be Erica, who's over there. And I'm also going to be on, although this is the first time I've seen the presentation we're going to run through, so my role is primarily going to be asking questions and facilitating your input into the webinar to clarify the journey we've been on within SustainUS and Erica's work within displacement. But my name's Dyanna. I was the COP21 delegation leader, so led our group last year and have been with SustainUS for a couple years since I actually first joined with Erica when we were on the delegation to COP20, which was in Lima, Peru. So Erica, I'll hand it over to you to get us started with the presentation and introduction.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dyanna, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Can you hear an echo?
I can't. You sound great to me.
All right. I'll assume it's just my computer. Wonderful. So to get started, I'm going to share my screen. So today we're going to talk about an issue that's perhaps at the margins of conventional discussion around climate change in the past, but increasingly in the really the last 5 years. The nexus of mobility, displacement, migration, refugees, and climate change has become more and more and more a hot topic for activists, for the media, and for policymakers in the UNFCCC process and beyond. So today we're going to talk a bit about some of the myths that are associated with climate displacement, and in particular debunk some of those myths. But before we get into that discussion, I'm going to tell everybody a little bit about my story of self and how I came to this work. I know that you all have recently completed your story of self challenge #1 for the SustainUS application, so hopefully this will provide a fluent transition from that experience to this webinar. And then after discussing some of these myths about the realities of climate displacement today, Dyanna and I will talk a bit about the current state of play regarding displacement issues in the UNFCCC process, at COP22, in other international spaces, and then perhaps most interestingly in regional and in local forum. And then lastly, we'll talk a bit about some of the stories that have been told around this issue and where the gaps and the opportunities are to tell other stories moving forward. So to contextualize why I'm talking about this today, I thought it could be useful to delve into my story of self. And to do that, I'm going to get rid of the presentation and speak to you with eye contact, because I think eye contact is very important, especially when we're talking about what's so often called the human face of climate change and these incredibly real, incredibly human dimensions to a topic that can so often be painted with only numbers and hockey stick curves. And I think in many ways climate displacement is this human face to the discourse. So before I start rambling, I guess I'll talk a bit about the story of why I'm here and that photograph that you just saw on the PowerPoint. When I was in undergrad, I was really interested in environmental issues, was really interested in climate change, was taking all of these classes, majoring in sustainable development, running recycling programs at my university, and really focused on, efficiency in buildings, and sort of really interested in environment, but uncertain about where I fit into this abstract and technocratic space. And then I think I realized about halfway through my sophomore year that the reason I cared about environmental issues was because I considered them to be human rights issues. And around the same time that I had that realization, I found myself studying abroad in Kathmandu through a program with Cornell. And all of a sudden, I was spending 6 months constantly thinking about how climate change was affecting some of the most vulnerable communities on our planet, but also some of the most resilient and powerful communities on our planet. And I had a month to do independent research and go anywhere in the country, and found myself in a very remote part of the Himalayas, a community or a district called Mustang, and met a woman whose eyes I can see staring into mine at the moment. She's elderly, probably in her 70s, and she described to me how, because of the past months, because of the past years of drought and food insecurity and agricultural failure and windstorms and temperature precipitation variability, she could no longer remain in the community where her ancestors had lived, in this village called Jaye. And she stared at me in my broken Nepali, I could barely understand what she was saying, but with the help of some translation, realized that she was telling me she had two options. She could either stay in the place where her ancestors had lived, this place that was affected by a drought that was so severe that she couldn't raise her livestock or have a crop, or she could move to Jomsom, which was a city a few 100 miles away. And I just remember that eye contact and that conversation taught me more about the reality of climate change impacts than any lecture with Jeff Sachs or any documentary by Al Gore or any internship. All of a sudden, I was having a conversation with somebody about what climate impacts meant to them in their daily life. And that community ended up using the term climate change refugee to get their story onto the media in Kathmandu. And I remember that conversation and her eye contact more than anything. And in that moment, I knew that climate displacement was an issue that I wanted to work on, at least for the foreseeable future. And really, ever since that moment, almost every decision that I've made and almost everything that I've worked on has been somehow related to this nexus of climate change and human rights. And at the moment, since that point, I've been writing my undergrad dissertation on the topic, and then spending some time with various internships and consultancies in Geneva and also in the US. And most importantly, going with SustainUS to both COP21 and COP20 and advocating for climate displacement to be an issue that's recognized in the UNFCCC process, alongside a coalition of youth, youngos from the Global North and Global South, as well as actors in this climate change and human mobility working group, which I'll talk a bit about later. So, and also folks from CAN International. So with this coalition of really inspiring, amazing humans working to get this issue into the text of these Paris agreements, but more broadly into the narratives that surround how we view climate change in contemporary times. So climate impacts are not a hypothetical future distant scenario, but a reality that's here and now. And I think a lot of the SustainUS mission focuses on creating a more sustainable and a more just world. A lot of that work that SustainUS does is focused on mitigation. 0 by 2050 is one example. But I think that climate impacts, and specifically climate displacement, is a narrative that's increasingly important and different part of the climate justice movement, perhaps, but a vital thing to be talking about, especially as we lead up to COP22. So, with that, perhaps more sentimental than it needed to be, story itself, let's get back to debunking some myths. And I'm struggling to figure out how to share my screen.
Thanks, Erica, for sharing that. And I'll just add from my perspective, you mentioned pushing SustainUS and adding that in addition to your work within all the different consultancies and UN agencies and places you've gone and academic spaces. I think from when I entered SustainUS a couple years ago and to where we are now, I can see a tremendous shift in how we prioritize and understand climate issues. And I think a lot of that has been your work and have been you pushing this narrative. So just chiming in on appreciation of that.
I think we've all grown so much, and I'm going to get sentimental about that too. All right, so thanks, Dyanna. Moving on, I guess I wanted to start out with one myth that's sort of a macro myth that's often portrayed by the media with regards to climate change and migration, climate change and displacement. This is a number that you'll see again and again, 150 million by 2050. So the myth is that climate change impacts will create 150 quote-unquote climate change refugees by 2050, and that this will pose a security threat to the borders of countries similar to the United States across the world. So within this myth are a number of sub-myths that we can talk about today. So number one, the media often portrays people who are forced to flee their homes, like that woman from Jaye village that I talked about earlier, as quote-unquote climate change refugees. But the reality is that that term is incredibly problematic, and terminology matters. There's a lot of reasons that various communities have advocated against using that term. First and foremost, the reality is that most people think of refugee as a cross-border movement, or at least that's how the Refugee Convention, how lawyers would define it. And the vast majority of people who are displaced by climate are internal, not across a border. We'll talk a bit more about causality later, but climate change is never... People who are forced to flee their homes, for instance, in the context of the current crisis in Syria, are fleeing so many things. There are so many factors, political, social, economic, demographic. You can never single out climate change as the exclusive driver for mobility. Second, the way that refugee as a term is defined in international law comes from the 1951 Convention, which defines refugee as a person who's fleeing from persecution due to political or religious reasons, or from their identity in a particular social group. And that definition, according to that legal convention, doesn't allow for discussion of environmental drivers such as climate change and any disaster. And so it's this major gap in international law, and when you use the term climate refugee, it means something that doesn't exist in legal terms. That being said, I'm not a lawyer, and a lot of words mean something in legal terms, and in lay people's terms don't mean the same thing. Still, there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of advocacy to not use the term climate refugee from the legal community. Another critique is from UN agencies and also state governments who would have to respond to the needs of these people. The reality is their mandates are already so overwhelmed that there's not room to expand to also focus on this additional population of people who are fleeing climate change. As we've seen from the most recent crisis in Syria, there's more people who need help than can get help already. And a lot of agencies are afraid of taking on this additional population. But what that means is that at the moment there is no dedicated agency to focus on this community. So there's a legal gap, there's these knowledge gaps from social science, and then here there's also an institutional gap. And then lastly, what I think is by far the most important reason not to use the term climate refugee is that communities on the front lines, especially in small island developing states, really resist this idea of being painted as refugees, as people who are fleeing and seeking international assistance. They would prefer images of resilience and this idea of being a climate warrior rather than a portrayal as a victim or someone who is in need of help and can't help themselves. Another reason is that the vast majority of instances, people want to stay. People don't want to have to leave their homes. And using the term climate refugees makes it seem as though it's inevitable and people will have to leave. A better term to use, perhaps, is this idea of being disaster displaced. I think in general, the term displacement is less negatively charged in the international discourses than refugee. It might be more applicable here. Another term you can use is environmental migrant. But in my opinion, the best thing to do to call the best term to use is just to describe the phenomenon as people who are moving because of climate impacts, rather than utilizing one of these terms that can be so contentious. However, I want to caveat this here by saying that maybe there are some reasons to use the term climate refugee. Recently, I was talking to a Belgian professor who feels very strongly that, in fact, the term climate refugee signifies persecution and signifies that people who are being displaced by climate impacts are, in fact, being persecuted by countries around the world that are overdeveloped and consumerist and dependent on the fossil fuel industry. So maybe, if anything, the term climate refugee for advocacy purposes makes this a political issue and takes it away from being depoliticized. So there's certainly an ongoing debate about this term. I would just note that if you are going to write a paper about the phenomenon of climate displacement or an article, it's probably best to put the term in quotation marks and say what media calls climate refugees. If anyone has questions about the nuance of this term, please ask me, because it's something I've thought a lot about and go back and forth on. But would also be curious to hear other people's perspectives. So myth number 2 is that the scale of displacement will be enormous, 150 million to 1 billion people by 2050. In reality, that number, 150 million, was calculated by a professor, Norman Myers, professor at Oxford, who drew that estimate based on very, very crude ideas of what sea level rise would mean for population movement. It's a debunked figure and not one that's supported by evidence. However, it's one that you'll see all over the place. So I think the myth that needs to be debunked here is that there is data. It's not just this future forecast of maybe 150 million, maybe 1 billion people, but the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center actually just yesterday released their annual report that shows that on average about 21.5 million people are displaced per year due to weather-related events. So those are the ones that are linked to climate change: droughts, storms, floods. This does not include geophysical hazards, which are earthquakes and volcanoes, but people are also displaced by those types of disasters, even though they're not directly climate-related. Myth number 3 is that there's a direct causal link between climate change and displacement. People often assume that there's an equation. Sea level will rise, people will move. But in reality, as I mentioned earlier, climate change is a threat multiplier and never is the only factor at play. So when you're writing articles and telling narratives about climate displacement, it's important to situate your analysis in a broader discussion of globalization and population growth and urbanization flows. There are social, demographic, political, and economic drivers that also influence a person's decision to move. And climate change, or any environmental change, affects the dynamics of each of those drivers, but isn't in and of itself the sole reason why people move. And finally, another myth is that people fleeing climate change impacts will cross international borders and will try to enter countries like the United States. However, in reality, most people who are forced to flee because of of climate impacts or disaster impacts will remain within their own country, or if they're going to move, it'll be within their region. It makes sense. People want to stay where the language is the same, where their culture is similar, where they have similar types of food, where the weather and the climate resembles their own. So even there have been some discussions about the government of the Maldives relocating part of its population to another country. That's one of the few cross-border instances. However, even if they do move, it will likely be to perhaps Sri Lanka or to India, to a place that's in South Asia, not millions and millions of miles across the Atlantic Ocean or Pacific, well, across an ocean, to the UK or to the United States. Myth number 5 is that displaced people after disasters, displacement in general, is something that happens in the future, over there in that distant land. It isn't something that happens here and now, and it isn't something that happens in developed countries. However, in reality, 63,000 Americans were displaced by disasters in 2015 alone, and this includes about 15,000 people in the state of New Jersey who are still, however many years after it struck in 2012, out of their homes. And it's worth noting that the people who are still without a solution, still outside of their homes, are 9 times out of 10, the vast majority, portions of the population that were already facing some type of marginalization or increased vulnerability. So it's the elderly population, or it's people of color, it's people who are in low-income communities. And in fact, there's evidence that the government of the state of New Jersey has created the response through FEMA in a way that it targets only supporting individuals who are relatively well off and most often white. So as you can see, climate displacement is an issue that's situated within so many other aspects of climate justice movement, and it's an issue of racism, it's an issue of systemic injustice and classism, and disasters and displacement might exacerbate these pre-existing vulnerabilities, but they're illustrating problems that are much deeper than just climate change. And they're extremely political and very hard to solve. As you can see, 2 years later, 3 years later, people are still not able to return home, even in the backyard of where I grew up. So this idea that displacement is something that only happens over there and in the future is flawed, and I think this is a narrative that needs to be shared with United States policymakers more than it is. So now, Dyanna, I'd love to hand it over to you and talk a bit about what the state of play is in the international space as well as in regional and local spaces. We've heard what some of the empirical realities of climate displacement are, but it's a useful exercise to think about what is the state of play, and then what are the gaps and opportunities for engagement.
Sure. Awesome. Thanks, Erica, for that rundown. I was taking notes over here, so super helpful. And so taking a bit of a step back to how displacement is talked about within the international policy, and specifically the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is for the COP22 is the annual meeting essentially of the UNFCCC. And the way that displacement is nested within that policy space is within loss and damage. And the story briefly of loss and damage is not a new one, but one that has gotten much more fiery in the last couple years. And since really the beginning in the first couple of decades of intergovernmental climate negotiation, the two main conversations were really always adaptation and mitigation. And the idea was focusing on those two pieces. You wouldn't need to ultimately respond to loss and damage, which was the third area of when you can't can't avoid the damages of climate change, then you have to deal with the damages that are occurring, which is loss and damage. And so for decades, the focus was just that, adaptation and mitigation. And it really wasn't until 2013 that loss and damage made a major breakthrough, and the more developed countries did recognize loss and damage as an issue that needed to be brought onto the negotiating table formally. And so in 2013, there was the creation of the Warsaw Implementation Mechanism, called the WIM, which is the international body specifically set to address loss and damage. And after that mile marker, the WIM kind of didn't take off very quickly in terms of anything actionable. And during that time was also the creation of the Paris Agreement. And so while this major agreement was being negotiated, being the Paris Agreement, loss and damage was put into big question space of where it would end up as a final stage in the agreement. And up until the last moment, I'd say was one of the most heated issues. And felt like the advocacy point was really saying that this deserves a place within this agreement, that the Warsaw International Mechanism wasn't enough on its own, and it needed to form a home in the agreement. And a lot of the hang-up was more around what was termed as compensation and liability. So Erica just took us through a more displacement-focused narrative of that policy piece, but the idea of liability and compensation, meaning essentially reparations for climate impacts, if that had a home in the agreement or not, was a huge bubbling issue all the way up to the very end of negotiations in Paris, and ultimately didn't make it into the agreement. But we are left with other tools to address loss and damage that now we really need to get started on, so that it essentially was ruled out in a very narrow way, but within the wording of the Paris Agreement, that liability and compensation is not the meaning of loss and damage was written into the agreement, and therefore other tools, what that means, are now really need to be developed, and a lot of that is focusing on displacement. So I actually want to throw it back to you, Erica, with that brief story on. And before I hand it back to you, I'll also add, I think the youth contingent of that, to me, felt really powerful. And I was able to participate in multiple rounds of negotiations leading up to the final round, where our delegation all got together in Paris. And without a doubt, loss and damage from the young people who were showing up at these negotiations was a huge priority. And because I think young people, more than the negotiators and decision makers, really do recognize that our lives are climate impacted lives, and that we will be inheriting an impacted world. And so this idea that we could even possibly have an agreement, our international climate agreement, that it was on the table that it might not speak to the current climate impacts, was really, I think, very boldly called out by the young people showing up. And Erica jumped in and really started coordinating a lot of that effort and supporting other young people. And she mentioned earlier this group called Youngo, which is essentially the youth constituency of the United Nations, and we work by forming working groups together, and Erica helped coordinate the working group of that body to focus on loss and damage and make sure that not a negotiating day could go by without young people really saying this is a huge priority for us to see in the Paris Agreement. But I want to give it back to you and essentially ask if you could articulate more back to specifically displacement, how that ended in the Paris Agreement in a policy sense.
Mm-hmm. So what does the agreement actually say about migration and displacement? The outcome of the negotiations creates this task force whose job it will be to develop recommendations for integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effects of climate change. What a bunch of jargon. What that actually means is that the UNFCCC and the WIM, this Warsaw mechanism, have agreed to take this issue seriously for the first time. Many years ago, there was, in the Cancun framework on adaptation, paragraph 14F, which highlighted how migration should be framed as an issue of climate adaptation. So migration is actually an adaptation mechanism to help people avoid climate impacts. However, that one paragraph aside, this past COP was the first time that it was really seriously addressed on a global stage with this creation of a task force. What this task force will actually do is still in flux. At the moment, they're developing these recommendations, and it's still to be seen what they do with those recommendations moving forwards. There's a lot of ambiguity around that task force and also around the Warsaw Mechanism on loss and damage more broadly, as Dyanna's mentioned. So it's worth noting that there's a lot of questions about whether or not the UNFCCC is even the right body to be taking on an issue like climate displacement. It's very clear from the past however many years that the UNFCCC is a really slow-moving process and very bureaucratic. People are being displaced today, here and now. Do we really have time to wait for the UNFCCC to get their act together? That's a really interesting question. I think it's important for that task force to serve as a catalyzing force to get people talking about this issue, and perhaps to create some type of money transfer. But it's by no means going to solve the climate displacement issue that we're facing as a planet. So I think it's worth noting that the UNFCCC process is one forum where this is talked about. Actually, before I go there, I'll talk a bit about what this means, this task force means as a success or a failure. Before there was nothing, that paragraph 14F, but very little. So now there's something. That's a major plus. Secondly, this signifies that the world is coming together, and people are starting to talk about this issue in a way they hadn't previously. That's definitely a positive. There was some type of consensus about climate displacement issues. Hello? Am I back?
Hey.
Cool.
Great. I wasn't sure if you froze or if I froze, so I didn't want to over speak for you.
I
guess it was you. Great.
A couple other international processes. The World Humanitarian Summit, which is coming up in Istanbul in just a week, is one forum. The Sustainable Development Goals, which happened in New York this past September, looking at how people who are displaced should not be left behind with development processes more broadly. And then the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is another space where climate displacement issues are being actively discussed. That's all the international space. I think the point where youth voices become the most important is not so much in the international space, although it is really important to be advocating there as well, but secondly in these regional and local forums. And before this call, Dyanna and I were talking about how there isn't really much maybe mobilization structure around climate impacts just because of the nature of the problem. You're not trying to shut down fossil fuel infrastructure. You're trying to build communities up and make them more resilient. But that's a major gap, and I think youth play a critical role in building more resilient communities. What would a community that isn't forced to relocate but can stay put, what would that look like? And what role does art and music and culture play in crafting that community? And also, how can we as youth who are passionate about these issues think about alternative solutions so that if people do have to move, they can do so in dignity and with respect to their human rights, rather than a forced movement. And that involves consultations with affected populations well in advance of the movement. There was recently an article in the New York Times just this past week about a community in Louisiana who's relocating. They've been trying to relocate for decades, but they're finally getting the funding from a package from the executive government to move. But what does that process of community consultation look like? And how can you be involved with shaping the way that mobility related to climate change is perceived in our local communities? Those are just a few ideas. Dyanna, do you want to chime in with any more about how local movements can build around climate impacts and human mobility?
Yeah, absolutely. And taking a step back again of why we wanted to bring this kind of focus into the Creative Challenge and continue to make it a major drumbeat of our work in SustainUS is that we really recognize that specifically around this issue, loss and damage and displacement, we have a lot of narrative power. And there's a lot of challenges that do involve technical or I guess more policy-based solutions, but even policy, I would say, is its own story. But a lot of our battle is just around the story that's being told, and I think Erica's myths really articulate that very well. And when we were doing our work in Paris, our delegation was really focused on that clause that I mentioned around liability and compensation, and we wanted so much more out of the Paris Agreement that was being developed, and then kind of had to have a real moment in ourselves, recognizing that what we were trying to see at this international level was urgent and necessary, but also so far ahead of our movement spaces back home, of outside of our movement, our political environments back home, and wanted to challenge ourselves to be more honest about that and discuss how we can use our narrative power, the media mics that we have as young people in SustainUS, as young people who are part of other movement areas, other communities, and bring this discussion back home to have power shaping that narrative in a lot of ways. And for myself, even I grew up in Hampton Roads, Virginia, which is the most endangered area on the East Coast to sea level rise. But yet, it never really makes it part of my climate story. It is always very future focused, always very carbon focused, and we can see these huge waves of mobilization a lot, as Erica said, around shutting down fossil fuel infrastructure and those elements. But how we kind of letting our power go to the side around actually engaging in the narrative around current climate impacts and displacement, and recognize that that does have power in what the United States is able to do internationally, or what all these countries are able to do at the international level. And so if we wanted to honestly target what's happening at the international level as SustainUS and bringing young people into that level, one of the things that we should also be doing is engaging more in our own stories that relate to current climate impacts in our home lives and in our movement spaces where we're located everywhere else. So that was a big motivator, I think, in recognizing the narrative power that we're up against, and all those myths that Erica laid out. They do have a lot of power in influencing what decisions are able to be made, and we need to be developing our own stories and our own alternative stories to that. And I actually had a question back for you, Erica, if I can flip this back around. One of the narratives I think I hear the most, and it does have a lot of power within policy spaces, is this national security kind of angle, and one that I think that we find almost the most hurtful and missing the mark in a very significant way, of talking about you have to act on climate because it's a national security threat of all these people who would come into our country. And there, you even do see that within climate communities hitting that drumbeat because they feel like it's some kind of motivator for action. And I think it's a difficult one because it's absolutely one that's not the story we want to be telling, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on maybe the best alternatives to that, and where you've seen really successful stories that to recognize the reality of climate threats and then kind of avoid that national security angle as their chosen motivator to action.
Yeah, Dan, I think you're totally right, especially at COP21, for instance. So many people kept using this narrative of, oh, we need to have a 1.5 degree goal as our long-term goal because otherwise we'll have hordes of climate migrants, that number 150 million, arriving at our doors. I think that so often refugees and migrants and displaced people of all kinds, for all reasons, are painted as rhetorical tools, or they call it engineered migration, getting political actors to react for fear of people arriving at their borders. And that's so problematic for many, many reasons. The first of which is that it doesn't paint people as agents, as people who are in control of their lives and who are doing this, making this decision because they have to. It paints them as almost like carbon dioxide emissions. They're this abstract concept and not people. So if we're talking about the human face of climate change, we have to be sure that we're respecting the human rights of the people who we're talking about as we discuss them. So I think a much better alternative narrative, alternative story to tell is this idea of, rather than national security, we should be focusing on human security. So you need to transform this narrative. I feel like that's become the catchphrase, from national security to human security, and focus on how climate impacts are affecting people's ability to function and ability to be a human and make autonomous choices on this planet. So by focusing on their agency rather than their victimhood, tell stories that are A, more powerful, I think, and B, more aligned with our goals of promoting a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, thanks for that. And then another question for you. I think one of the things I've heard you talk about that's most compelling to me, and you briefly mentioned it earlier, but the idea of celebrating mobility and creating new and different ways that we understand migration. Wondering if you want to add more to that and where there's also narrative power within the idea of how we just understand the process of mobility globally and also internally.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, people don't want to move, and painting mobility as a desirable thing is often problematic because, as I mentioned earlier, it depoliticizes the issue, and it is just against people's sense of home and people's sense of identity that's so often tied to the physical territory that they live on. But that being said, I think one of the challenges that we're facing in a world where we are increasingly mobile is thinking about how mobility isn't always a negative thing, and how maybe we can think about migration that's voluntary, or relocation that's voluntary, not forced displacement, as either adaptation mechanisms to help avoid eventually being forcibly displaced, or as perhaps beautiful parts of the way that we exist on this planet. So what if there was a way to celebrate a retreat to higher ground festival, or have a cultural a holiday that focuses on the beauty of building resilience through migrants who send remittances back to their homeland. Or I mean, there's so many ways to rethink about the paradigm of displacement and the paradigm of mobility. And I think this is where the youth perspective is really important, because there have been the same old perspectives that have been recycled since the 70s. And I think there's a need for injection of new thought on migration.
Totally, I definitely agree with that. Well, is there anything you wanted to run through further, Erica? I think we're over 40 minutes now, so we can get towards wrapping it up. unless you have other points.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'll share a few more ideas about stories that might need to be told. Let's see.
Great.
Do this. Screen share. Maybe? Okay. So this list is by no means meant to be comprehensive, but just a few ideas about narratives that perhaps need to be promoted around issues of climate impacts and climate mobility. First and foremost, this idea that this is not just a future hypothetical, but an issue that's here and now, not only in developing countries, but in our own backyard, even in the United States. In fact, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, amongst many others, and this most recent case in Louisiana, as well as instances in Alaska, are powerful illustrations of how climate displacement is an issue that's faced by all corners of our globe, including the United States. Another story that I think needs to be told is leveraging narratives of resilience and how people don't have to move. I think so often people are focused on the movement dimension, but it's equally important to show how people are able to be strong and not need to be forcibly or voluntarily moved. And then, as I mentioned before, narratives that convey the agency of people who are forced to flee as people who are in control of their lives rather than as security threats. And then lastly, youth perspectives. I think, as Dyanna mentioned earlier, climate displacement is an issue of intergenerational equity. Climate impacts are going to impact our future and the lives of our children and our children's children. And I think as young people, we have a responsibility to use our voices to show how this is not the future that we want to see created, and how we're going to build back better and be more resilient. And also be more tolerant. I think tolerance of difference and accepting people across borders is fundamentally important, and narratives that show how we are human first before we are identities of nationality or race or ethnicity or class are extremely powerful, and I think youth have a critical role to play in that. So to build a world in which we will accept migrants as though they are our families and our community members, especially when they've been forced to flee by climate change related impacts. There's a lot of changing that needs to happen in our globe beyond just building United Nations conventions. Yeah, I think building human faces and building human connections is what this is all about.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Erica, for running us through all of that. And I'll close this out by saying I think there's the point we wanted to highlight the most was around how powerful the stories that we tell are in this area, and how much we just took an issue that otherwise could be described as a super dry policy levers type issue and tried to put it into all the narratives that are complicating how that's playing out and how we can engage in that, and then remind us that storytelling doesn't always mean opinion pieces published in newspapers, but it is photography and it's videos and it's songs that ground us in different ways, and yeah, creative social media. There's so many ways that we can engage with the story and become part of that, and whether it's bringing it to our hometowns or engaging with a larger national, international story, there's a lot of power at that level. So that's what I hope to see come out of this, and the submissions coming in from the Creative Challenge have been super fun and really love what's going forward. So I know Eric and I are happy to be in touch. Erica's finishing her master's degree, but can probably still answer some questions and would be excited to. So be in touch, and yeah.
Takeaways. Number one, terminology matters, and number two, numbers matter, and there's a human story behind every number. So if you're going to cite numbers, make sure that convey the human story behind that statistic. Hopefully,
Yes.
in touch soon.
Cool. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.